ripping that metal down the side was also ripping that far into the root ball of the plant. And it disrupted any circling roots that were, wrapping around like that. I just pulled this plant, out of that container, and I haven't disturbed the root ball at all. Now this plant is not overly rooted. It's not, certainly doesn't have big, huge, girdling roots going around like that. But I would either, if it's cool months of the year, I'd just take my fingers and kind of break up this root ball a little bit. If I was planting in the heat of the summer, I'd just take a sheetrock knife and rip down one side of it before I put it in the ground. And the plant would probably do well. Very few people do that, but I think it's a very important thing to do. The other thing that you should do when buying trees especially, and we try to do it, I won't promise you that we're 100%, things slip through the cracks, so to speak, but if you've ever watched the canning operation in a wholesale nursery, when they are moving plants from a small container to a big container, they don't always do it the right way. And that brings up another question. Everybody asks, how big a plant should I plant? I always tell them, buy the biggest plant you can afford or the biggest hole that you can dig. A 1-gallon plant is just as good as a 5-gallon plant, is just as good as a 15-gallon plant. And the only difference is time. You're buying time. The bigger the plant you buy, the more time you are buying, because it takes a year. A plant that's in a gallon container like this, the difference between that and the 5-gallon plant is a year's growth. The difference between that and the 15-gallon plant is a year's growth. Yeah, if you've got the money, and especially if you're only going to live in that house for 5 years, buy the biggest plants you can buy and plant them so you can enjoy them. But if you're on a limited budget, you have 16 acres to plant or something like that, buy the small plants and be very patient with them. But if you watch people moving this plant, or trees are actually the absolute worst, moving them from a 1-gallon container to a 5-gallon container, what do? They pop them out of one container, stick them into the 5-gallon container, and pour a bunch of soil around it. Okay, that trunk's now been buried this deep. Comes time to move it into a 15-gallon container, they pull it out of the 5-gallon pot, put it into a 15-gallon pot, dump the stuff in. By the time that plant gets to the nursery yard or to you, that trunk may already be buried this much too deep. And you really need to look for that, and if it has been buried, you really need to uncover it before you put it into the ground. And if you're moving into a home with an existing landscape, and granted you may pull two-thirds of the material out, but you're probably not going to pull out the trees, look very carefully. If the tree looks like a fence post into the ground, it's buried. If you see a root flare like that, that tree or shrub is growing at the level at which it should grow. So if you've got plants that are planted too deeply, different ways of getting the soil away. Sometimes you can just dig it out. If you call a professional in to expose the root flare, they're probably going to use something called an air spade. An air spade is a really remarkable thing. It's a piece of pipe literally attached to a very high volume air compressor, and it literally blows things away, blows the soil out of the way, and does virtually no damage to the trunk of the tree or existing roots or anything else. To tell you how gentle that blast of air is, probably somebody here knows. You know what the air spade was originally designed for? It's a military tool, I'll tell you that much. Used to uncover landmines without exploding. Go out and do this and blow the soil away, and then whatever those brave people do that deal with all that sort of stuff to disarm them and get rid of them. But that's what the air spade was developed for uncovering landmines. And so you can imagine how gentle it is to the trunk and to the roots of your tree. I don't know if there are air spades available for rent or not yet, but virtually every decent tree company has at least one nowadays. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I have that problem, and I dug out about 3 feet around. How much should I dig around?
You dig down until you find the flare. You want air circulating around the trunk of the tree. I don't really care whether it's an inch or whether it's a foot. But if that tree, you ought to leave room for it to grow. I would move out whatever distance is convenient, put a silo around it, so to speak, whether it's brick, metal, something, permanent to help keep the soil from just filling back in. But, if it's a fast-growing tree, obviously leave a bigger well around.
No, it's a big well.
I'd probably go out 8 or 10 inches. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have to take any consideration for the drip line of your tree?
No. Drip line is, in our soils, is meaningless. We used to say a drip line, you know, that the roots of the tree go out about as far as the spread of the branches. In our lousy soil, the drip line probably encompasses less than half of the root zone of the tree. The drip line is 50 feet out, the roots are probably at least 100 feet out. In deeper soils, it might have some meaning, but not here. Yes, ma'am?
What if the roots to the tree are all exposed, all above ground, and you can see it?
Well, that was the tree's choice. So obviously it's not really harmful to the tree. It's very harmful to lawnmowers and people that may trip over them. And again, I get this all the time. People say, oh, the roots of my tree are rising up out of the ground. No, they're not. The roots are at the same level they've always been. But if that root was 2 inches in diameter and now it's 6 inches in diameter, it grew 4 inches. 2 inches down, 2 inches up. Trees don't mind that at all. If you want to cover those roots, that's fine. Won't harm the tree. Just don't bury the trunk. What people generally, I suggest you do, because it's going to be a problem. If you fill it up to where you've completely covered the roots, what's going to be there 5 years from now? Those roots are now, you know, again, 2 inches taller again. I tell people, number one, you shouldn't have planted that much grass to begin with. Number two, if the trees are growing that big and that full, it's going to be too shady for the roots to do well anyway, or for the grass to do well anyway. So get rid of the grass and plant ground cover or something like that. But it doesn't hurt a tree to have roots up on the surface. That's sort of the combination of, number one, having shallow soils to begin with, and number two, what everybody's tendency is, and that is to water too often and not enough when you water. The roots are going to grow where the moisture is. And if you've got a sprinkler system and you're running it for 15 minutes 4 times a week, you're wetting the soil about this deep, and that's where all your root growth is going to be. If you're watering properly and really soaking things very, very deeply, you're going to get a much deeper root system and have fewer problems. But if you've only got 2 inches of soil to begin with, it's always going to be an increasing problem.
Question?
Yes?
I'm sorry, someone asked about drip line, and you say it doesn't really matter here in trees. So if you're trying to water a tree or an existing shrub, so you just put the soaker hose or anywhere you want?
Cover as much of the root zone with water as you can, and realize if this is the tree, small tree, and the drip line is here, that the roots are probably out here. Put as much mulch as you can on the surface and water as wide an area as you can. The least important area to water is right there against the trunk. Yeah. Because the part of a plant's roots that takes up moisture, you can't see. That root, that woody thing that you see, is basically just a pipe to carry nutrients down the root and to carry water up the root. Xylem moves water, phloem moves nutrient material. But that root surface is covered with what we call root hairs. And I've heard estimates that the root hair actually expands the surface area 10,000-fold or something like that. That is what is taking up the water, that's what's taking up the nutrients. If you let a plant get too dry, the root hairs are what have died, then the plant starts dropping yellow leaves, and then it looks worse before it looks better no matter what you do. That's when the Super Thrive hopefully saves its life while it's developing new root hairs. But anyway, that has a bit to do with water uptake. Yes, sir?
My neighbor asked me the other day how important it was to keep ball moss out of your oak trees.
Whole different subject, and the answer is not at all. Ball moss is a bromeliad. It's an epiphyte. It's not a parasite. It will grow on a dead tree as quickly as it will on a live tree. If ball moss does any damage whatsoever, it reduces the light that penetrates the interior of the tree, which means the tree's not going to have many leaves and small limbs toward the inside of the tree. But ball moss has been here a whole lot longer than people have. And it's made a lot of people a lot of money knocking on doors saying this stuff's going to kill your tree unless you pay me $500 to pick it out. Now, if you don't like it, you can get rid of it, but it's not going to hurt your trees. Okay, yes ma'am?
I have a couple of Arizona ash trees that are 30 years old that need to go away.
Okay.
What's the best way to remove these things?
Chainsaw?
Well, the roots and the stumps.
That's a good question.
Above ground, below ground.
Getting rid of stumps. A good tree company will have something called a stump grinder, which will grind it 6 inches down into the ground and get rid of the physical presence of the stump. Only thing that's going to make the stump go away long term is rotting, and that's going to take time. You can speed the process up, but you know, one other thing, everywhere that a tree's roots go, The main thing that decomposes that kind of woody stuff in the soil are fungi, mushrooms and toadstools, if you will. And these things are breaking down that wood fiber, and periodically they decide that they want to reproduce. Up to the surface comes this thing that we think of as a toadstool